They called her a gold digger. They called her a placeholder. Everyone in that courtroom, including her billionaire husband and his smirking mistress, thought Gabrielle Calloway was walking out with nothing but the clothes on her back. The ink was wet on the divorce decree. The gavel was raised. But just as Preston Calloway laughed, thinking he'd won the perfect victory, Gabrielle didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a single, coffee-stained piece of paper that froze the entire room. What Preston forgot he signed 10 years ago didn't just cost him his fortune. It cost him his freedom. The air conditioning in the Superior Court of Los Angeles hummed, but it did little to cool the stifling arrogance radiating from the plaintiff's table. Preston Calloway sat with the relaxed posture of a man who owned the building, the judge, and the very air everyone else was breathing. At 42, Preston was the face of Calloway Tech, a logistics software empire valued in the billions. He wore a Navy bespoke suit that cost more than most people's cars, and his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were currently dancing with amusement. Next to him sat Tiffany Snow. She was 23, a former fitness influencer turned aspiring interior designer, dressed in a white pencil skirt that was perhaps a bit too tight for a courtroom. She had her hand resting conspicuously on Preston's forearm, flashing a diamond ring the size of a skating rink. It wasn't technically an engagement ring, not yet, but the message was clear. Out with the old, in with the new. On the other side of the aisle sat Gabrielle Calloway. She sat alone, save for her court-appointed attorney, a weary man named Mr. Klein, who looked like he had accepted defeat before he even parked his car that morning. Gabrielle was 38, but today she looked older. She wore a simple charcoal dress, high-necked and conservative. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She kept her eyes fixed on the mahogany table in front of her, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from trembling. "Mr. Calloway," Judge Montgomery said, peering over his spectacles. The judge was a stern man with a reputation for speeding through divorce settlements, especially when the outcome seemed obvious. "Your counsel has presented the argument that the marital assets, specifically the controlling shares of Calloway Tech and the Malibu estate, are sole and separate property, acquired prior to the marriage or protected by the standard prenuptial agreement signed in 2014. Preston's lawyer, a shark named Bradford, with teeth that seemed too white to be real, stood up. "That is correct, Your Honor. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad. It explicitly states that in the event of a dissolution of marriage, Mrs. Calloway is entitled to a one-time payout of $50,000 for every year of marriage. They have been married for 10 years. That is $500,000. Preston is feeling generous, so he is willing to round it up to $700,000. We believe this is more than fair, considering Mrs. Calloway has not been employed since the day of the wedding." Tiffany let out a small, audible giggle, quickly covering her mouth with a manicured hand. Gabrielle didn't flinch. She knew what they said about her. She knew the narrative Preston had spun in the tabloids, the lazy housewife, the leech, the woman who got lucky and trapped a genius. 700,000, Judge Montgomery mused. In Los Angeles, that won't get you far, but the law is the law. If the prenup holds, my hands are tied. Preston leaned forward, his voice smooth and deep, designed to charm. "Your Honor, I've tried to be reasonable. Gabrielle, she's a nice woman. But we've grown apart. I've built an empire. She's enjoyed the lifestyle that empire provided. I just want to move on with my life. I have a future to plan." He squeezed Tiffany's hand. Mr. Klein, Gabrielle's lawyer, sighed and stood up half-heartedly. "Your Honor, My client argues that she contributed significantly to the emotional stability of the household, allowing Mr. Calloway to build his business. We are asking for spousal support of—" "Denied," Judge Montgomery cut him off, looking at his watch. "Unless you have proof of financial contribution or a secondary contract, the 2014 document stands. Mr. Calloway's assets are protected." The courtroom felt like a closing vice. Gabrielle could feel the eyes of the reporters in the back row burning into her neck. She could hear the scratch of their pens. Billionaire dumps frumpy wife, the $700K payoff. Preston turned to look at her. For the first time that morning, he made direct eye contact. His look wasn't one of pity. It was one of absolute triumph. He mouthed 2 words to her. "Game over." "If there are no further objections," Judge Montgomery said, picking up his pen, hovering it over the divorce decree that would finalize the settlement, "I am prepared to sign the judgment as requested by the plaintiff." The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Tiffany was already reaching into her purse, probably to text her friends that she was officially the future Mrs. Calloway. Bradford was stuffing files into his briefcase. "Wait." The voice was soft, barely a whisper. Judge Montgomery paused. "Excuse me?" Gabrielle stood up. She didn't look at her lawyer. She didn't look at the judge. She looked straight at Preston. "I said wait." "Mrs. Calloway," the judge said, sounding annoyed, "your lawyer has already spoken. Unless you have new evidence, this proceeding is concluded." "I do," Gabrielle said, her voice gaining strength. "I have new evidence." Preston chuckled aloud. "Gabrielle, please, don't embarrass yourself. Just take the check and go." "I don't want your check, Preston," Gabrielle said, reaching down to the battered leather portfolio she had brought with her. It was an old thing, scuffed at the edges, a stark contrast to Tiffany's pristine Chanel bag. "And I don't want the 700,000. She unzipped the portfolio. The sound was like a zipper tearing through the tension in the room. "What is she doing?" Tiffany whispered loudly. "Preston, make her stop." "Order," Judge Montgomery warned. "Mrs. Calloway, what is this evidence?" Gabrielle pulled out a document. It wasn't a crisp, legal-sized filing. It was a single sheet of yellow legal pad paper. It was wrinkled, as if it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. There were stains on it, coffee rings, maybe even a drop of old wine. She walked past her stunned lawyer and approached the bench. "This," Gabrielle said, her hand finally steady, "is the real prenuptial agreement. The one Preston signed 3 days before our wedding. The one he begged me to sign because he was afraid." Preston's face went from smug to confused. "What? I never signed anything on yellow paper. She's forging things now. Your Honor, this is desperate." "Approach the bench," Judge Montgomery commanded. Gabrielle handed the yellow paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Bradford, Preston's lawyer, scrambled up to look over the judge's shoulder. Judge Montgomery adjusted his glasses. He read the first line, then the second. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He looked at the signature at the bottom. Then he looked at Preston. "Mr. Calloway," the judge said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. "Is this your signature?" Preston waved a hand dismissively from his seat. "I sign 1,000 things a day. I don't know what scraps she's dug up from the trash." "Come look," the judge ordered. It wasn't a request. Preston huffed, buttoning his jacket, and walked to the bench. He looked down at the yellow paper. The text was handwritten in blue ink. It was messy, scrawled in a hurry. But the signature at the bottom, a jagged, aggressive loop, was unmistakably his. And the date was clear, August 12th, 2014. Preston's face drained of color. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. I don't remember this," Preston stammered. I was We were at that bar in Chicago. I was drunk. This can't be legal. It's notarized, Gabriel said from behind him. Look at the stamp, Preston. You insisted on it. Do you remember why? The courtroom erupted into whispers. The judge banged his gavel, but his eyes remained glued to the yellow paper. Mr. Bradford, Judge Montgomery said, handing the paper to Preston's lawyer. Read the clause marked with the asterisk, aloud. Bradford took the paper. His hands, previously so steady, were shaking slightly. He cleared his throat. He looked at Preston, whose eyes were wide with a dawning, horrifying recognition. Read it, the judge barked. Bradford swallowed hard. It says, in the event that Callaway Logistics utilizes the coding algorithm known as Project Lazarus, created solely by Gabriel Turner, all subsequent profits, patents, and derivative assets shall be considered joint property with a 70-30 split favoring the creator, Gabriel Turner. Bradford stopped reading. The silence that followed was absolute. Tiffany stood up, confused. What does that mean? What is Project Lazarus? Gabrielle turned to face the room. For the first time, she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator who had finally sprung the trap. Project Lazarus, Gabrielle said, addressing the court, is the source code for the routing system that made Callaway Tech worth $3 billion. Preston didn't write it. He couldn't code his way out of a paper bag in 2014. I wrote it. I wrote it on my laptop in a studio apartment while he was out networking at bars. Preston gripped the edge of the table. You gave that to me. You said it was a gift. A wedding gift. No, Gabrielle corrected him calmly. I said I would let you use it to launch the company if you signed a guarantee that you wouldn't cut me out once you got rich. You were crying that night, Preston. You were terrified the investors were going to pull out because you had no product. You begged me to fix the code. So I did. And I made you sign this. It's on yellow paper, Preston shouted, losing his composure entirely. It's nonsense. It's not a formal contract. Judge Montgomery leaned forward. Mr. Callaway, in the state of California, a contract requires an offer, acceptance, and consideration. It does not require fancy stationery, and a notarized signature is a notarized signature. This document predates your standard prenup by 3 days, and most importantly, it specifically addresses intellectual property, which your standard prenup conveniently omits. The judge turned to Gabrielle. Mrs. Callaway, are you asserting that the bulk of the marital estate is derived from this Project Lazarus? Every penny, Your Honor, Gabrielle said. Callaway Tech was a failing trucking brokerage until they implemented my algorithm. It cut their shipping times by 40%. That is the only reason they were acquired. That is the only reason he has that plane. That is the only reason he has that ring on her finger. She pointed at Tiffany. Tiffany looked down at the ring as if it had suddenly burned her skin. She looked at Preston. Is that true? Did she write the code? Shut up, Tiffany, Preston snapped, sweat beading on his forehead. He turned to his lawyer. Bradford, fix this. Argue duress. I was drunk. Bradford looked at the paper again. Preston, the notary stamp. It's from a bank. Banks aren't open at 2 a.m. when you're drunk at a bar. You went to a bank to sign this. Gabrielle nodded. The next morning. You were hungover, yes. But you were sober. You dragged me to the Wells Fargo on 4th Street because you needed the code uploaded by noon for the venture capital meeting. You signed it in front of the bank manager, Mrs. Higgins. Mrs. Higgins is dead, Preston yelled. You can't prove it. Actually, Gabrielle said, pulling a second sheet of paper from her portfolio, I have an affidavit from Mrs. Higgins's successor, who retrieved the record from the bank's archival logs. And I brought a witness who was there. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A tall man in a wheelchair rolled in, pushed by an attendant. He was elderly, frail, but his eyes were sharp. Preston froze. Dad? It was Franklin Calloway, Preston's estranged father. Gabrielle walked over to the wheelchair. Franklin was the one who drove us to the bank that morning, because your car had been towed. Preston, remember? Franklin Calloway cleared his throat. His voice was raspy, but amplified by the courtroom's acoustics. I remember, the old man said. I told you not to sign it, son. I told you that girl was too smart for you. But you were greedy. You wanted the money from the investors more than you wanted your dignity. Preston sank into his chair. He looked like a balloon that had been pricked. Judge Montgomery looked at the documents, then at the witness, then at Preston. Mr. Bradford, the judge said dryly, I suggest you ask for a recess, because right now it looks like your client doesn't just owe his wife half. If this 70-30 split on the yellow paper is valid, he owes her the majority of the company. Recess! Bradford screamed. We request an immediate recess. The judge banged the gavel. 30 minutes. But don't go far, Mr. Calloway. We are just getting started. As the room dissolved into chaos, reporters shouting questions, Tiffany trying to pull the ring off her finger, and lawyers scrambling, Gabrielle calmly zipped up her portfolio. She walked past Preston. He was staring at the table, his face grey. She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear. You should have rounded it up to 1 million, Preston, she whispered. Now, I'm taking it all. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung shut, sealing the chaos inside, but the hallway offered no sanctuary. It was a corridor of echoing marble and harsh fluorescent light, a place where whispers carried like shouts. Preston Calloway paced the length of the corridor, his expensive Italian loafers clicking rhythmically against the stone. He was unraveling. The veneer of the untouchable billionaire was cracking, revealing the panicked, insecure man beneath. He pulled out his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen, likely texting board members or perhaps his offshore bankers. Tiffany Snow stood near the water fountain, her arms crossed so tightly across her chest she looked like she was trying to hold herself together physically. The smugness was gone. In its place was a dawning, icy realization. She watched Preston pace, her eyes narrowing. Preston, she said, her voice shrill. What does 70-30 mean? Does that mean you keep 30%? Because 30% of $1 billion is still... That's still okay, right? Preston spun around, his face flushed. It means she takes the controlling interest, Tiffany. It means she owns the board. It means she can fire me from my own company. And if she audits the books from 2014, God, she'll see the seed funding transfers. You said she was stupid, Tiffany hissed, taking a step toward him. You told me she was a placeholder. You said she just sat at home baking cookies while you built the world. I thought she did, Preston shouted, then lowered his voice as a security guard glanced their way. I forgot about the paper. It was 10 years ago. I was desperate. I would have signed my soul away that night to get that code. Well, you apparently did, Tiffany snapped. She looked at her ring again, then at the exit sign. The calculation in her eyes was transparent. If Preston wasn't the king, Tiffany wasn't interested in being the queen. At the other end of the hallway, Gabrielle sat on a wooden bench next to Franklin Calloway's wheelchair. She handed the old man a bottle of water. You did good, Frankie, she said softly, using the nickname she'd given him years ago, back when she was the only one in the family who bothered to visit him in the hospital. Franklin took a shaky sip. I didn't do it for the money, Gabby. I did it because he put me in that home, the cheap one, with the damp walls. He glared at his son down the hall. He bought a $40 million jet last year, but told me he couldn't afford private nursing for my hip surgery. He's a bad seed. I'm glad you're finally pruning him. Gabrielle patted his hand. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her forensic accountant, a man named Simon Leclerc, who was currently sitting in a server room in Zurich, digitally tracing Preston's ghost accounts. Message: I found the Seychelles transfer and the payment to Snow Interiors. It's worse than we thought. Gabrielle's jaw tightened. She stood up and smoothed her dress. Preston saw her movement and walked over, trying to compose his face into something resembling empathy. He stopped 5 feet away, safe from the reach of her anger, but close enough to smell her perfume, a scent he hadn't noticed in years. Gabrielle, he started, his voice dropping to that persuasive baritone he used on shareholders. Look, things got heated in there. But we don't need to do this. We don't need to destroy the company. If the stock drops because of this litigation, we both lose. Let's settle. I'll give you $20 million. Cash. Today. Gabrielle looked at him, her expression unreadable. $20 million? 30. Preston counted quickly. $30 million. You can move to Paris. You always wanted to go to Paris. You can start your own, whatever it is you do. Painting? Baking? I write code, Preston, she said coolly. I've always written code. You just stopped asking. Okay, fine. You write code. Take the $30 million. Don't let the old man drag you down. He gestured to his father. He's just bitter. He's your father, Gabrielle said. And he's the only reason you made it to the bank that morning. Do you remember what you promised him if the company took off? You promised to buy back his mother's house in Georgia. Instead, you bought a condo for Tiffany. That's irrelevant, Preston snapped, his patience fraying. This is business. The yellow paper, it's a partnership agreement, sure. But we were married. Marital assets merge. My lawyer will argue that the 2014 prenup superseded the yellow paper because it was signed after. Gabrielle took a step closer. She was shorter than him, but in that moment, she loomed. You think I didn't think of that? She whispered. You think I've been sitting in that empty house for 3 years, waiting for you to come home from your business trips with Tiffany, just crying into my pillow? I've been studying, Preston. I went back to school online. I got my master's in corporate law, and I hired Simon Leclerc. Preston's face went white. He knew the name. Everyone in the tech world knew the name. Leclerc was the forensic accountant who had taken down the CEO of Omnicorp last year. You hired Leclerc? He's expensive, Gabrielle shrugged. But he works on contingency, and he found the consulting fees you've been paying to Tiffany for the last 2 years. $200,000 a year for office aesthetics. She glanced at Tiffany, who was now pretending to examine a painting on the wall, trying to distance herself from the sinking ship. That's embezzlement, Preston, Gabrielle said. Draining company funds, our partnership funds, to pay your mistress. That pierces the corporate veil. It breaches fiduciary duty. It means the standard prenup is void because of fraud. Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Time's up, Gabrielle said, as the bailiff opened the courtroom doors. Let's go finish this. The atmosphere in courtroom 4B had shifted. Before the recess, it was a funeral for Gabrielle's marriage. Now, it was a gladiator arena, and the lion had just been released. Judge Montgomery looked refreshed, likely having consulted with his own legal clerks during the break. He sat high on the bench, his gaze falling heavily on Bradford, Preston's attorney. "Mr. Bradford," the judge began, regarding the document entered into evidence as Exhibit B, the yellow paper. "Does your client dispute the authenticity of the signature?" Bradford stood, looking sweaty. "Your Honor, while the signature appears to be my client's, we argue that the document was an informal memorandum of understanding, drafted without legal counsel, and was effectively nullified by the formal prenuptial agreement signed 3 days later. The prenup contains a standard integration clause, stating it is the final and complete agreement between the parties." "A valid point," Judge Montgomery nodded. "Usually the later contract rules." Preston let out a breath he had been holding. He shot a look at Gabriel, a look that said, "Nice try." "However," the judge continued, raising a finger, "Mrs. Calloway's counsel has submitted a motion during the recess regarding fraud." Bradford stiffened. "Fraud, Your Honor? That is preposterous." "Is it?" Gabriel's lawyer, Mr. Klein, stood up. He seemed to have absorbed Gabriel's confidence. He looked 10 years younger. "Your Honor, the integration clause in the prenup is only valid if the parties disclosed all assets and intentions honestly at the time of signing. We have evidence that Mr. Calloway was already in breach of the partnership agreement, the yellow paper, before the prenup was even signed." "Explain," the judge ordered. Gabriel stood up. She didn't need Mr. Klein for this part. She knew the numbers by heart. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and projecting to the back of the room, "the yellow paper, signed August 12th, established a 70-30 partnership based on my intellectual property, Project Lazarus. On August 13th, 1 day before the prenup and 2 days before the wedding, Preston Calloway opened a shell corporation in Nevada called Blue Horizon Holdings." She picked up a stack of documents from her table. "He transferred the initial seed money, $50,000 from our joint savings account, into Blue Horizon. He then listed Blue Horizon as the sole owner of the Project Lazarus copyright in the filing he sent to the patent office. He stole the IP from our partnership and hid it in a shell company solely under his name, 24 hours after promising me 70% of it." The courtroom gasped. This wasn't just a divorce dispute anymore. This was corporate theft. "He lied on the prenup disclosure forms," Gabriel continued, locking eyes with Preston. "He listed his assets as zero, except for a used car. He didn't list Blue Horizon. He didn't list the IP. That is perjury. That is fraud. And fraud vitiates all contracts. The prenup is trash, Your Honor. The only valid contract that remains is the yellow paper." Preston jumped up. "She's lying. Blue Horizon it was just a holding strategy. It was for tax purposes." "Sit down, Mr. Calloway," Judge Montgomery bellowed, "or I will hold you in contempt." The judge turned to Gabriel. "Do you have proof of this transfer?" "I have the bank routing numbers, the patent filing with his signature, and the articles of incorporation for Blue Horizon," Gabriel said, handing the stack to the bailiff. "It's all there." The judge leafed through the papers. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the rustling of pages and the ticking of the clock. Finally, Judge Montgomery looked up. He took off his glasses. "Mr. Bradford," the judge said quietly, "your client appears to have committed fraud on the court, fraud against his spouse, and potentially securities fraud. The 2014 prenuptial agreement is hereby declared null and void ab initio due to fraudulent non-disclosure." Tiffany gasped loudly. "Does that mean—" "It means," the judge said, looking at Preston with distaste, "that we revert to the prior agreement. The yellow paper stands. Mrs. Calloway is confirmed as the 70% majority owner of the underlying intellectual property of Calloway Tech. Preston slammed his fist on the table. You can't do this. The company is public now. You can't just give her majority control. The shareholders will revolt. The stock will tank. Actually, Gabrielle interrupted, her voice cutting through his panic like a knife. That's the other thing, Preston. She turned to face him fully. You mentioned earlier that the company is worth billions because of the algorithm. Because of my code. Yes, Preston cried. And if you take it, you destroy the value. The code has a fail-safe, Gabrielle said. The room went deadly silent. What? Preston whispered. I wrote it in 2014, Gabrielle explained, sounding like a teacher lecturing a slow student. I knew you, Preston. Even then, I knew you had a wandering eye and a greedy heart. So I built a poison pill into the Lazarus kernel. It's a line of code that requires a periodic authentication key. A key only I have. Preston's eyes widened. The updates. You always insisted on doing the server updates yourself from home. I thought you were just being controlling. I was renewing the lease, Gabrielle said. Every 6 months, I entered the key to keep the system running. But since you served me divorce papers last week, I decided not to renew it. Preston looked at his watch. When does it expire? Today, Gabrielle said, checking the wall clock. At noon, which was 4 minutes ago. At that exact moment, Preston's phone on the table lit up, then Bradford's phone, then Tiffany's phone. It was a cascade of notifications. Preston grabbed his phone. His face turned a shade of grey that looked like wet cement. The servers, he choked out. The logistics grid, the trucks, they've all stopped. The system is offline. We're losing $10 million a minute. You're not losing anything, Gabrielle corrected him. The company is losing it. My company. Fix it, Preston screamed, lunging toward her, restrained only by his lawyer grabbing his arm. Turn it back on. You're destroying everything. I'm willing to turn it back on, Gabrielle said, her voice calm, turning back to the judge. But not as a wife, and not as a partner. She pulled one final document from her portfolio. It was crisp, white, and stapled. I'm willing to reboot the system as a consultant, Gabrielle said. My fee is simple. I want Preston's remaining 30% shares transferred to me. I want full liquidation of Blue Horizon Holdings, and I want the Malibu house. You want everything? Preston wheezed. You want to leave me with nothing? No, Gabrielle said, glancing at Tiffany. I'm leaving you with her. And since you just admitted in open court that you've been paying her from company funds, I'm sure the IRS will want to talk to both of you about that unreported income. Tiffany stood up, grabbed her Chanel bag, and looked at Preston with pure disgust. I'm not going to jail for you, Preston. I'm done. Don't call me. She stormed out of the courtroom, the click of her heels the only sound in the stunned room. Preston stood alone, stripped of his fortune, his company, and his trophy girlfriend in the span of 20 minutes. Judge Montgomery looked at Gabrielle with a mixture of shock and respect. Mrs. Calloway, the judge said, it seems you have Mr. Calloway in a negotiate or die position. Mr. Calloway, do you accept the terms, or do you want to let the company burn to the ground while you explain to the SEC why the system crashed? Preston looked at the phone. The messages were pouring in. System failure. Fleet grounded. Stock plummeting. He slumped into his chair, a broken man. I'll sign, he whispered. I'll sign anything, just turn it back on. Gabrielle uncapped a pen. She didn't hand it to him immediately. She held it for a moment, savoring the weight of it. First, she said, say it. Preston looked up, tears of rage and humiliation in his eyes. Say what? Say that I built it, Gabrielle said firmly. Say that without me, you are nothing. The silence in courtroom 4B was no longer heavy. It was absolute. It was the kind of silence that follows a gunshot, where the ringing in the ears is the only evidence of violence. Preston Calloway stood trembling, his hands gripping the mahogany table so hard his knuckles had turned the color of bone. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, a friendly face, a loophole. He found nothing. The court reporter waited with bated breath. The bailiff stood with his hand near his belt, sensing the volatility of the man in the three-piece suit. Say it, Gabrielle repeated, her voice steady, lacking any tremor of emotion. She held the pen out, but she didn't step closer. She made him reach for it. Preston swallowed a lump of pride that felt like broken glass. He looked at the phone screen still glowing on the table. Stock price, 18%. Server status, critical. Every second of hesitation was costing him millions of dollars in market cap, but the words she demanded cost him something far more expensive. His ego. You, Preston croaked. He cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the floor. You built it. Louder, Gabrielle commanded. So the court reporter can hear you, so your father can hear you. Preston squeezed his eyes shut. You built the code, he shouted, his voice cracking. You built Project Lazarus. Without you, the system doesn't work. Without you, I have nothing. The confession hung in the air, ugly and raw. Gabrielle didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply placed the settlement agreement on the table. Sign. Preston grabbed the pen. He didn't read the terms. He didn't check the fine print. He scribbled his signature on the line for respondent, tearing the paper slightly with the force of his pen stroke. Turn it on, Preston pleaded, tossing the pen down. Please, Gabrielle. The investors are calling my personal cell. The trucks are frozen on the freeways. It's chaos. Gabrielle picked up the document. She blew on the wet ink, checking the signature. Then she handed it to the judge. Your Honor, the plaintiff accepts the terms, Gabrielle said. I am now the sole owner of Calloway Tech and all associated IP. Mr. Calloway retains his personal vehicle and his personal checking account, pending the IRS audit, of course. She pulled out her phone. She didn't call anyone. She didn't type a complex code. She simply opened a generic-looking solitaire app, tapped the King of Hearts 3 times, and pressed a hidden prompt that appeared. Authorize key refresh? She tapped yes. Instantly, the phones on the table lit up with a different tone. The barrage of error messages stopped. Bradford, Preston's lawyer, checked his iPad. Systems are coming back online. The routing grid is green. Preston collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He had saved the company, but he had lost it in the same breath. Mr. Calloway, Judge Montgomery said, his voice devoid of sympathy. Since you have admitted to fraud and perjury in my courtroom, I am forwarding the transcript of today's proceedings to the district attorney's office. You are ordered to surrender your passport to the bailiff before you leave this building. You are a flight risk. Preston's head snapped up. What? No, I have a conference in London next week. Not anymore, the judge said. And I suggest you find new counsel. Mr. Bradford looks like he's ready to resign. Bradford was already packing his briefcase. I represent clients, Preston, not criminals. You lied to me about the Blue Horizon accounts. I'm out. Gabrielle turned to leave. She walked over to Franklin Calloway, who was beaming in his wheelchair. Ready to go, Frankie? She asked. I think we have a house to buy in Georgia. Wait! Preston scrambled over the bar, stumbling toward her. Gabrielle, wait! Where am I supposed to go? You took the Malibu house. You froze the accounts. I can't check into a hotel. My credit cards are linked to the company. Gabrielle stopped. She looked him up and down, taking in the bespoke suit, the frantic eyes, the sheer pathetic reality of a man who had never had to fend for himself. She reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill. She tucked it into his breast pocket. "There's a bus stop on 5th and Grand," she said softly. "The fare is $2.50. That leaves you enough for a burger. I hear the cafeteria here isn't bad." She turned her back on him and walked out the double doors, the click of her heels sounding like a victory march. 6 months had passed since the verdict, but the landscape of Silicon Beach had changed forever. The skyscraper that once bore the name Callaway Tech had been rebranded. It was now simply Turner Logistics, named after Gabrielle's maiden name. The massive portrait of Preston that used to hang in the lobby, an oil painting of him looking visionary while holding a globe, had been replaced by a sleek digital mural of the code itself, constantly shifting and evolving. Gabrielle sat in the corner office on the 40th floor. The room was different now. She had removed the Scotch bar and the golf putting green Preston had installed. In their place were whiteboards covered in schematics and a large table where she held open meetings with her engineering team. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was the engine. Since taking over, stock prices had stabilized and then soared. The market loved a redemption story, but more than that, they loved competence, and Gabrielle was relentlessly competent. Ms. Turner, her assistant, a sharp young woman named Sarah, buzzed in. "The SEC auditors are leaving. They've finished the review of the Blue Horizon Shell Company." "And?" Gabrielle asked, not looking up from her tablet. "They found the transfers," Sarah said, sounding satisfied. "Preston wasn't just hiding IP. He was washing money for some unregulated gambling sites. They're estimating the indictment will drop on Friday." Gabrielle nodded slowly. "Send the files to the DOJ. Do not shield him. If he used my servers for illegal activity, I want it purged." "Understood. Also, there's someone in the lobby to see you. He doesn't have an appointment." Gabrielle spun her chair around to look at the view of the Pacific Ocean. "Let me guess. He's wearing a suit that's seen better days?" "He says it's urgent," Sarah replied. "He says he has information you need." "Send him up," Gabrielle said. "I have 5 minutes." A few moments later, the doors opened. Preston Callaway walked in. But it wasn't the Preston of the courtroom. This Preston looked hollowed out. He had lost weight. His hair, usually dyed a rich chestnut, was showing grey roots. He wasn't wearing bespoke Italian wool. He was wearing a rack suit that fit poorly at the shoulders. He stood awkwardly by the door, clutching a manila envelope. "Nice office," he said, his voice raspy. "I see you changed the carpet." "I got rid of the stain," Gabrielle said, gesturing for him to sit. He sat. "You have 5 minutes, Preston. I have a board meeting." "I need a loan," Preston blurted out. He didn't try to charm her this time. He was past that. "Just a small one, 50 grand, to pay a retainer for a criminal defense lawyer. The public defender they gave me is an idiot. He wants me to plead guilty." "You are guilty," Gabrielle pointed out. "But I can't go to prison, Gabby. I'm not built for that. I have anxiety. I have dietary restrictions." He was sweating, his eyes wide with genuine terror. Gabrielle leaned back. "You embezzled $4 million. You defrauded the court. You committed perjury. And you tried to steal my life's work. Prison is exactly where you're supposed to go." "I have dirt on Tiffany," Preston said, sliding the envelope across the desk. She was in on it. She signed the checks for Snow Interiors. "If you help me, I'll testify against her. I'll give you everything to destroy her." Gabrielle looked at the envelope with distaste. "You still don't get it, do you? You think life is just a series of transactions. You think you can trade one betrayal for another? She pushed the envelope back to him. I don't need your dirt, Preston. Tiffany was arrested this morning at LAX, trying to board a flight to Dubai. Simon Leclerc tracked her credit card. She's already in custody. Preston's face crumbled. The last chip he had to play was worthless. I'm living in a motel, he whispered. In Reseda. There are roaches, Gabby. I drive a 2005 Corolla. I deliver food for an app. Do you know how humiliating that is? Delivering lunch to the same buildings I used to own? It's honest work, Gabrielle said coldly. Something you should have tried years ago. She stood up. Your 5 minutes are up. Please, he begged, tears streaming down his face. We were married for 10 years. Does that mean nothing? Did you ever love me? Gabrielle paused. She walked to the window, looking down at the city below. A city that respected her. A city that finally knew her name. I loved the man I thought you were, she said. I loved the man who cried in that bar in Chicago because he was afraid to fail. But you killed that man a long time ago, Preston. You killed him with greed. And then you tried to kill me with neglect. She pressed the intercom button. Sarah, security, please. Preston stood up, his face contorting into a mask of hate. You think you've won? You're just a bitter, lonely woman with a lot of money. You'll never be happy. You're cold. You're ice. 2 security guards, burly men who didn't know or care that Preston used to sign their paychecks, entered the room. Escort Mr. Calloway out, Gabrielle ordered, and if he returns, call the police immediately for trespassing. As they dragged him out, Preston screaming obscenities about how unfair the world was, Gabrielle didn't flinch. She simply sat back down at her desk, picked up her stylus, and went back to work. 8 months later, the fluorescent lights of the Federal District Court were far harsher than the warm, ambient lighting of the divorce court where this journey began. The air smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a scent that Gabrielle had come to associate with the slow, grinding gears of justice. She sat in the back row, almost invisible in a beige trench coat and dark sunglasses. She wasn't there to testify. Her deposition had been given months ago, a 300-page document that detailed every dollar Preston Calloway had siphoned from their partnership. She was there simply to witness the end. At the defense table, Preston looked like a ghost of the man who had once graced the cover of Forbes. The prison-issue orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his frame, a stark contrast to the bespoke navy suits he used to wear like armor. His hair, stripped of its expensive dye and styling, was thinning and grey. He sat hunched over, refusing to look at the gallery. A few feet away sat Tiffany Snow. Her transformation was equally jarring. Gone was the arrogance, the Chanel, and the sneer. She wore a similar jumpsuit, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, revealing a terrified young woman who had gambled her youth on the wrong man. Mr. Calloway, Judge Kavanaugh said, his voice booming through the silent courtroom, you stand before this court, convicted of 14 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of tax evasion, and 1 count of securities fraud. You betrayed your shareholders, you defrauded the government, and you attempted to destroy the very infrastructure you claimed to build. Preston stood up, his legs shaking. Your Honor, I was under pressure. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted to maintain the valuation. I can pay it back. If you just give me time. You had 10 years, Mr. Calloway. The judge cut him off sharply. You had a brilliant partner whom you marginalized. You had a father whom you neglected. You had every advantage, and you chose greed. The judge turned a page in the file. The court takes into consideration the testimony of your co-conspirator, Ms. Snow, who provided the ledger of the offshore accounts in exchange for leniency. Preston whipped his head around to glare at Tiffany. She stared straight ahead, a tear tracking down her cheek. It was the final twist of the knife. The woman he destroyed his marriage for had been the one to hand the prosecutors the smoking gun to save her own skin. "Preston Calloway," the judge pronounced, "I sentence you to 84 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $4.2 million. The gavel banged. It sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. As the marshals moved in to cuff Preston, he looked up. His eyes scanned the room desperately until they locked onto Gabrielle in the back row. For a second, the old Preston flickered in his eyes. A plea, a demand, an expectation that she would fix it. Gabrielle slowly lowered her sunglasses. She held his gaze for a heartbeat, her face completely void of pity. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply put her glasses back on, turned on her heel, and walked out of the courtroom. The great unraveling. 2 months later, the final remnants of the Calloway name were being scrubbed from existence. Gabrielle stood in the center of the grand ballroom at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. It was the site of the bankruptcy auction for Preston's personal estate. The room was packed with vultures, collectors, rivals, and curiosity seekers, picking over the bones of his extravagant life. Item 402, the auctioneer announced, a collection of vintage watches, Patek, Rolex, Audemars, starting bid at $50,000. Gabrielle watched as a tech CEO from Silicon Valley bought the watches Preston had loved more than his own family. She felt nothing. The objects held no power anymore. Item 409, the auctioneer continued, a velvet jewelry box containing a vintage emerald brooch and a pearl necklace, circa 1950. Gabrielle's hand shot up. She held up her paddle, number 703. 5,000, she called out clearly. I have 5,000, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 6? A man in the front row, a dealer looking for a quick flip, raised his paddle. 6. 10,000, Gabrielle counted instantly, her voice cutting through the chatter. The dealer turned to look at her, surprised by the aggression of the jump. He hesitated, then lowered his paddle. Sold, to the lady in the back for $10,000. Gabrielle walked to the collection desk to claim the item. It wasn't just jewelry. It was the only thing Franklin Calloway had left of his late wife, Preston's mother. Preston had stolen it from his father's safety deposit box years ago to use as collateral for a gambling debt. Retrieving that box felt better than acquiring the company. It was the final correction of the cosmic scales. The quiet victory. The Georgia heat was tempered by a soft breeze coming off the marsh. The renovation of the farmhouse was complete. It was a sanctuary of white shiplap, wraparound porches, and peace. Gabrielle sat at a teak table on the veranda, her laptop open. The screen displayed the quarterly earnings for Turner Logistics. Since she had purged the poison pill and rewritten the core architecture, efficiency was up 200%. The stock was trading at an all-time high. The business world, which had once dismissed her as a trophy wife, now studied her management style in business schools. Franklin wheeled himself out onto the porch. He was wearing a new cardigan, looking years younger than the frail man in the courtroom. "You have a package," he said, handing her a thick manila envelope. "No return address, but it's postmarked from Chino." Gabrielle took the envelope. She knew who it was from. Preston? She weighed it in her hand. It felt heavy. Pages and pages of excuses, blame, or perhaps false apologies, designed to manipulate her into sending money to his commissary account. "Do you want to open it?" Franklin asked gently. Maybe he's finally sorry. Gabrielle looked at the envelope, then out at the willow trees swaying in the yard. She thought about the yellow paper signed in a bank 10 years ago. She thought about the late nights coding while he was out partying. She thought about the moment the judge realized who the real genius was. "No," Gabrielle said softly. "I don't think I do." She didn't tear it up in a dramatic fit of rage. She didn't burn it. She simply set it down on the table, unopened. "His words don't rewrite reality anymore, Frankie," she said. "He's a ghost. We don't let ghosts haunt this house." She pushed the envelope aside and opened a new browser tab. "What are you working on?" Franklin asked, wheeling closer. "The future." Gabrielle smiled, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I'm setting up a scholarship fund for women in STEM, specifically for girls who are told they're just support staff. I'm calling it the Lazarus Initiative." "Fitting," Franklin chuckled. "Rising from the dead." "No," Gabrielle corrected him, typing the first command. "It's not about rising from the dead. It's about realizing you were never dead to begin with. You were just waiting for the right time to wake up." She hit enter. The fund went live. The money transferred, millions of dollars that Preston had once hoarded, now flowing out to change the lives of 1,000 other Gabrielles. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. Gabrielle Calloway Turner closed her laptop, took a sip of her iced tea, and listened to the silence. It wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was the sound of a life fully, completely, and apologetically her own. The karma wasn't that Preston was in a cage. The karma was that Gabrielle had flown so high she could no longer even see him down there. So what's the real lesson here? It's not just about a prenup or a billion-dollar company. It's about the fatal mistake of underestimating the person who holds your life together. Preston thought Gabrielle was just a background character in his movie, but he forgot that the person who writes the code controls the reality. He chased the flash, the young girlfriend, the fast cars, the arrogant lawyers, and ignored the substance. Gabrielle proves that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes, silence is just the sound of someone sharpening their blade. She didn't scream, she didn't fight dirty, she just kept the receipts. In a world full of Prestons who think they can talk their way out of anything, be a Gabrielle. Know your worth, keep your records, and when the time comes, don't just win the argument, own the board. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good drama, and subscribe for more stories about karma hitting hard. What would you have done in Gabrielle's shoes? Let me know in the comments below.